They mocked America as soft. They laughed that its soldiers lived on chocolate and coffee, that its people were too spoiled to fight a real war. But when German prisoners of war were shipped across the ocean and sat down for their first meals in U.S. camps, the laughter stopped. What they tasted wasn't weakness. It was a strength so great, it could feed even its enemies. Propaganda and mockery. In Nazi Germany, food wasn't just a necessity. It was turned into a weapon of propaganda. The regime fed soldiers the same story over and over. America was soft. Its people were spoiled. Its soldiers dependent on luxuries. And its factories nothing more than assembly lines for indulgence. Radios declared that U.S. troops survived on chewing gum, chocolate, and Coca-Cola. Newspapers claimed that without canned fruit and coffee, the Americans wouldn't last a week in the field. In the trenches, these stories became jokes. Around smoky campfires and inside freezing bunkers, German soldiers mocked their enemy as weak. They bragged that while they endured black bread, cabbage soup, and watered-down beer, the Americans needed steak and candy bars. A photograph of smiling GIs with cigarettes and candy only fueled the laughter. To them, food symbolized character. Germans believed hardship forged strength, while plenty bred weakness. By ridiculing American rations, they weren't just mocking their enemies' stomachs, they were protecting their own pride. It was easier to laugh at abundance than admit the frightening truth. An army that was both well-fed and well-armed might be impossible to defeat. Capture and expectations. But when capture came, the bravado was tested. In North Africa, Italy, and later across France, tens of thousands of German troops surrendered to Allied forces. Stripped of their weapons and marched into barbed wire holding pens, they began to whisper about what awaited them overseas. The propaganda they had once laughed at now twisted into fear. Rumors spread quickly. Some swore that in America, prisoners would be starved into submission. Others claimed they would be given only scraps, treated worse than animals. A few whispered darker possibilities: forced labor in coal mines until they collapsed, or quiet executions far from home. On the long voyage across the Atlantic, the mask of arrogance returned. Prisoners filled the silence with bitter jokes, insisting that the Americans would bungle their duties, that their food would be inedible. "Let's see how these spoiled Americans feed us," they jeered, loud enough for guards to hear. But behind the sneers was unease. In the cramped holds, every clang of pots from the ship's galley, every faint smell of food carried upward, reminded them of what they were about to face. None of them believed it would be kindness. They braced for cruelty. They braced for hunger. They braced for humiliation. And yet, the moment they set foot on American soil, everything they thought they knew would collapse. Their first taste of America would not be starvation, but abundance. Arrival in America. When the German prisoners finally crossed the Atlantic, their first glimpse of America stunned them. They had expected a poor, chaotic land. Instead, the ships pulled into harbors lined with towering cranes, endless rows of trucks, and sprawling factories that never seemed to end. The docks buzzed with activity, trains rattling on the tracks, workers unloading cargo with speed and precision, the smell of oil and steel heavy in the air. For many Germans, it was their very first look at America, and it did not match the image painted by Nazi propaganda. There were no starving masses, no disorganized chaos. Instead, they saw a country that seemed almost overflowing with energy and order. As they were marched onto waiting trains, they noticed the cars stretching farther than most had ever seen in Europe. Through barred windows, the countryside flew past. Fertile farmland, neat towns, highways packed with cars, factories with smokestacks billowing into the sky. The silence among the prisoners grew heavier. Some whispered in disbelief. Others kept their thoughts buried, unwilling to admit what their eyes told them. The mocking laughter that once came so easily was fading, replaced by an uneasy awareness. This was not weakness. This was something else entirely. The first meal. Still, the prisoners clung to one expectation, that their food would reveal the truth. Surely here, at last, the mask would fall. Marched into camps, surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers, they braced themselves for thin soup and stale bread. Instead, they were led into orderly mess halls, the smell of cooking filling the air. Wooden tables were set row after row, and from steaming kitchens came plates piled higher than any of them imagined. Bread, fresh and soft. Meat, vegetables, sometimes even potatoes with gravy. On some days, there was coffee, a luxury many Germans hadn't tasted in years. For men who had grown used to hunger at the front, this was nothing short of shocking. The first meal silenced them. Forks clinked, spoons scraped, but few words were spoken. The food was not only plentiful, it was good. Some prisoners muttered bitter jokes that they were eating better as captives than their families back in Germany. Others simply stared at their plates in disbelief before eating every bite. What they had feared as punishment was, instead, a strange form of generosity. And in that first meal, many realized something they could never say out loud. America had strength enough to feed even its enemies. Daily diet in the camps. The first meal shocked them, but what truly broke their expectations was the routine. Day after day, the food kept coming. It wasn't just one generous gesture, it was a system. Breakfast was often bread with butter or jam, sometimes eggs, oatmeal, or even bacon when supplies allowed. For men used to starting their mornings with nothing more than crusts of black bread and bitter coffee substitute, it felt surreal. At midday came stews filled with beans, peas, or lentils, often with chunks of meat mixed in. Dinner might bring roast beef, pork chops, or chicken with potatoes, gravy, and vegetables. And on Sundays or holidays, many camps even served dessert, pies, puddings, or canned fruit that tasted almost like luxury. The real revelation was coffee. In Germany, coffee had become a rare memory. Families stretched tiny rations with roasted acorns or barley. But here, in captivity, steaming mugs of real coffee were handed out daily. For many POWs, the rich aroma in the mess hall was more shocking than the sight of guards with rifles. The change in their bodies was obvious. Soldiers who had marched into captivity thin and hollow-cheeked began to put on weight. Their uniforms, once tight from months at the front, started to loosen as their frames filled back out. American medical officers noted the irony with dry humor. These prisoners of war were often healthier in captivity than they had been while serving the Reich. It wasn't fine dining, but compared to the hunger gnawing at Europe, it was abundance. And in that abundance, the German soldiers began to realize something they had never been told. America's strength was not only measured in weapons and machines, but in its ability to feed millions, even its enemies, without strain. Reactions among POWs. The food stirred something deeper than hunger. It stirred questions. At first, many prisoners tried to laugh it off. In the barracks, they joked bitterly, saying the Americans were trying to fatten them up like pigs before slaughter. Others whispered that it was all part of a psychological trick. Give the enemy comfort to break his will. But with every passing day, the routine never changed. The plates remained full, the meals steady, the coffee hot. For some, the irony was painful. Letters from home painted a bleak picture. Wives standing in long lines for rationed bread, children going without meat for months, whole families living on turnips and ersatz coffee. And here, behind barbed wire, German soldiers were served more than they could finish. Some wrote back with shame, others with guilt, and a few never mentioned the food at all, fearing their families would resent them. Among the prisoners, arguments broke out. Hardcore Nazis insisted that American food was a weakness, that luxury would rot the spirit. But others, quietly, admitted that it was strength. After all, what kind of nation could feed millions of its own citizens, fight a world war on 2 continents, and still feed its enemies with regular meals? The laughter that once filled the transports across the Atlantic was gone. In its place was a heavy silence, punctuated only by the scrape of spoons in tin bowls. Each meal became less about filling stomachs and more about chipping away at the propaganda they had once believed. To mock America now seemed foolish. To admire it was dangerous. And yet, with every bite, admiration grew all the same. Comparison with Germany. The longer the prisoners stayed in America, the harder it became to ignore the contrast with home. Letters trickled in from Germany, and almost everyone told the same story. Shortages, ration cards, and hunger. Families wrote of standing for hours in lines that stretched around blocks just to buy bread or potatoes. Meat was rare. Butter and sugar were luxuries. Coffee, once a staple, had all but disappeared, replaced by bitter substitutes made from barley or acorns. Some POWs kept these letters folded tightly in their pockets, reading them again and again until the paper wore thin. And each time they walked into the camp mess hall, with its smell of fresh bread, its trays of meat and vegetables, its steaming mugs of real coffee. The difference between the world inside the wire and the world back home became impossible to deny. The irony was painful. Men who had marched off to fight for the Reich now sat at long wooden tables, eating better than their wives and children. Some felt shame, others guilt, and a few even stopped writing about food altogether, afraid that honesty would wound the people they loved most. It wasn't just about meals anymore. It was about what those meals represented. In Germany, the war machine had consumed everything: food, fuel, even the future. In America, abundance seemed endless. The prisoners realized that the rations on their plates were not scraps from a crumbling system, but simply the overflow of a nation strong enough to fight and still feed millions. Every bite was a reminder. Nazi propaganda had been a lie. The bigger realization. Over time, food became more than survival. It became a lesson. At first, the Germans had laughed at American rations, sneering that steak and chocolate would make soldiers soft. But in the camps, with every orderly meal, with every steaming mug of coffee, they saw that abundance was not weakness at all. It was power. The Americans did not need to starve their enemies to prove their strength. They had confidence enough to feed them. That quiet confidence was disarming, more effective than cruelty could ever have been. Around the barracks, conversations shifted. Some prisoners still clung to Nazi ideology, declaring that German discipline would outlast American comfort. But many others began to wonder, if a nation could treat its captives with this level of order and humanity, what else might it be capable of? For some, the thought lingered long after the war ended. They returned home carrying stories of steaming kitchens, clean mess halls, and the strange reality of eating better in captivity than in freedom. A few never went back at all, choosing instead to remain in the very country they had once mocked. The propaganda had told them America was weak, divided, and doomed to collapse. But the reality on their plates told a different story. A nation so strong it could win a world war and still set a prisoner's table with bread, meat, and coffee. In the end, the laughter died away. What began as mockery ended as reluctant admiration. And for thousands of German soldiers, the taste of America was not bitterness, but abundance. Conclusion. In the end, the German prisoners discovered that America's greatest weapon was not just its factories or its armies, it was its abundance. They had expected cruelty, starvation, and humiliation. Instead, they found clean barracks, steady meals, and even a strange kind of humanity. For many, it was their first taste of freedom from fear, a freedom served not with propaganda, but with bread, meat, and coffee. Some carried that memory back to Germany, telling their families in hushed tones about the surprising kindness of their captors. Others chose never to leave, building new lives in the very country they had once mocked. The lesson was clear. True strength is not proven by starving your enemies, but by having the power to feed them. And for thousands of German soldiers, the real face of America was not weakness. It was confidence, prosperity, and the quiet certainty of a nation strong enough to win with both power and mercy.